Hello and welcome. In this video, we are talking about one of the most popular and probably the most confusing to use model in the Helix, the Fullerton. Is one of the most popular models in the Helix. Some well-known Helix users have said that it's their favorite, and the Fullerton is what's called a tweed amp. One of these guys right over here. You should go watch Rhett Shull's video on the tweed sound. He does a great job of breaking down those amps and giving you some good sound samples. So if you're anything like me and you came to this amp without any context, you probably thought, oh, it's a Fender, it should be loud and clean, right? My first amp was a Fender Blues Deluxe reissue, and that amp was loud and clean and tweed. So it should sound something like that, right? Spoiler alert, I was about to be very confused. I was very confused when I first fired up the model of the Fullerton, and it's not clean. And I'm turning the drive down, trying to get it cleaner, trying to match what I expected, and it gets dirtier. What? So here's the thing. You might have noticed that whether or not you pulled up the Fullerton Norm or the Fullerton Bright channel, you still have controls for the normal drive and bright drive. And that's probably pretty confusing. What do those do? The reason is because those controls are interactive, and they are both active whether or not you're plugged into the normal channel or the bright channel. And so that's why both models include both controls in the circuit, because they make a big difference. I've linked to an article on tweed amps that really helped me figure this out, but I'll give you a shortcut. Think of the opposite drive, so the one you're not plugged into, as a headroom control instead of a drive control. I'll say that again one more time. Opposite drive is your headroom control. Turn it all the way up, and you're going to get the cleanest sounds you can out of the amp. Turn it down, and it'll get dirtier and dirtier. And if you're wondering, yes, it can be clean. And yes, it can be ambient. But to be honest, that's not what these amps are for. People use them for that, mostly I think for that sort of edge of breakup tone. Now, so those were some edge of breakup tones. Now you can crank the headroom, the opposite drive, down to get even more overdrive, and obviously crank the drive up to get some pretty crazy tones within the amp. It starts to kind of sag and compress, and the power amp really can't handle what's happening in the circuit as you smash the guitar really hard, especially on the low strings. The low end is the thing that really pushes it over the edge. Here's some examples. And finally, there's sort of that Neil Young amp falling over sort of sound. If you just go completely nuts and crank the headroom way down and the drive way up, and even jumper the channels using the jump model, things get pretty crazy. And as you start hammering those low strings or hammering really hard, that you can just feel the amp sort of like giving in and sagging and compressing, especially as you smash those low notes. Here's a fun fact about Neil and his tweed. He has this crazy winder robot that actually sits on top of the amp. I'll put up a picture here. Sits on top of the amp that is basically a robot with some servos that actually physically turns the knob so that he can get different presets of sounds within from his one tweed amp. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about with this amp model, and that is the bias control. If you were listening to some of those sound samples and you were thinking, there's this like papery fuzziness that I don't really like about it, I'm 100% with you. I feel the same way. Lots of people love it. That's kind of what the amp does, and it's a cool thing. But maybe you want to get rid of that a little bit. Maybe you like it, but you want to dial it back a little bit. You have some control there. And this is where we're going to talk about the bias parameter. We're going to test out the bias parameter. Snapshot 1 is default 5 in the middle. And then I'm going to switch it to snapshot 2, which is bias all the way 0. And then we'll snapshot 3, bias all the way 10. And I'll play the same riff, and hopefully we can hear the difference there. Now to my ears, the default bias setting sounds more crossover-y than either of the two other settings we just listened to. And that makes sense. When you're setting the bias to an extreme level, either all the way down or all the way up, you're locking the amp into that mode of operation, and it's not getting the chance to cross over into the other mode and thereby create that crossover distortion. Now, would you use either of those sounds in a gig for a real tone? Maybe not, maybe. For my ears, I kind of like to crank that bias down a little bit, maybe 2 or 3. That to me just seems more usable, more likable to me, to my ears. But please try it out, crank it up and down, play it a bunch, and let me know in the comments where you ended up and what sounded better to you. So that's all for this amp. I had fun researching this Tweed amp stuff and learning how the amps worked and playing through the sound samples. I hope you had fun watching this video. Thank you for watching. And remember, if it sounds good, it is good.